For pianists, Chopin's first ballade seems so familiar and so firmly established in the repertoire that it's perhaps easy to overlook just how extraordinary this music truly is. Writing in 1841, 5 years after the first ballade was published, Schumann recognized it for what it was and called it one of Chopin's wildest and most original compositions. Written during his early years in Paris, the first ballade was an important milestone in Chopin's output. Up to that point, Chopin's music could be categorized into two major strands, reflecting the prevailing distinction at the time between brilliant virtuosic works written for public display on the one hand, and more serious, substantial works drawing on the tradition of Viennese classicism on the other. The first ballade, along with the first scherzo, represents Chopin's first attempt at synthesizing these two strands, subjecting conventional virtuosic passage work to tighter structural logic, while at the same time expanding the dramatic possibilities of traditional forms. The first ballade was especially significant because, in an age when extra musical programs and descriptive titles were in vogue, Chopin demonstrated that it was possible to take a different path, namely to imbue his music with rich narrative expressivity without resorting to any specific programmatic connection. Prior to Chopin's application of the title ballade to an instrumental work, the term was closely associated with vocal music, referring in particular to a simple strophic song, usually in compound duple meter, such as this ballade from Robert le Diable, an opera that Chopin admired. The term was also used in literary contexts, namely ballad poems. But whether musical or literary, the key idea is that ballads or ballades tell a story, often set in the remote, glorified past. So think of chivalric knights, supernatural beings, heroic deeds, and tragic adventures. The ballad poems of the renowned Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz were written in this vein, and there's been much speculation about the influence of Mickiewicz's works on Chopin's ballades. Schumann recalls hearing Chopin's performance of the second ballade. At that time, Chopin also mentioned that certain poems of Mickiewicz had suggested his ballades to him. Nevertheless, it remains unclear which of Mickiewicz's poems were supposed to have inspired Chopin's ballades. In any case, I don't think that it's necessary to have specific poems or stories in mind in order to understand these works. The ballades are first and foremost narratives in tones, whereby rich expressive meaning can already be derived from the sequence of musical events. Structurally, the ballades take sonata form as their point of departure. Here's a general scheme that's applicable to all four ballades. Two themes in contrasting tonalities are presented. Over the course of the work, these two themes become more intertwined with each other. Tension is raised through development and variation. The themes then return, not necessarily in the same order that we first heard them, but definitely in a grander, more brilliant transformation. This is especially true of the second theme. All four ballades conclude with a virtuosic coda, which, with the exception of the third ballade, is based on new material. So we can see that insofar as sonata form is about the presentation, development, and reprise of two themes, all four ballades certainly follow this familiar plan. Nevertheless, the ballades also deviate from sonata form in striking ways. In a minor mode sonata form, the dominant typically arrives at the end of the development section, prior to the return of the main theme in the tonic at the start of the recapitulation. In his ballades, three of which conclude in the minor mode, Chopin postpones the arrival of the dominant to just before the coda. He does this by prolonging not the mediant, but the submediant, and most notably in the fourth ballade, the subdominant. Even the third ballade, the only ballade of the four to be cast in the major key, follows this trajectory. By doing this, Chopin is essentially transferring the structural weight to the end, and the coda becomes the powerful dramatic culmination of the entire piece. The first ballade combines features of sonata form with an arch-like construction. We can see this in the long-range symmetry produced by the reversed recapitulation, where the second theme is brought back in its original key rather than the tonic. This arch shape already conveys something about the expressive arc of the entire piece. Beginning in brooding G minor, we make our way to the remote realm of A minor and A major at the zenith of the arc, only to be dragged back eventually by the irresistible gravitational pull of G minor. Interestingly, if we were to map out the prominent bass tones throughout the ballade, we would see that the arch shape is reflected here too. The recitative-like introduction broadly arpeggiates an A-flat major harmony in first inversion. Only in retrospect do we realize that this is actually an off-tonic start, implying the Neapolitan harmony of G minor. Also noteworthy is the fact that Chopin uses a single line both to imply the harmonic foundation and to produce the melodic contour. In a rich, resonant voice that immediately commands attention, a storyteller seems to be saying, "Once upon a time." I think that we can trace the ancestry of this passage back to the first movement of Beethoven's Tempest Sonata at the start of the recapitulation. Here too, a major triad in first inversion is arpeggiated, leading into recitative-like musing. Though seemingly rhapsodic and inconsequential, the turn figure in measure 4 will take on greater dramatic urgency in the development section. Having opened up an expansive registral space from the bass C to the high C 4 octaves above it, we now settle on yet another C in a more comfortable register. And for the first time we hear a solid harmony. If the opening suggestion of A-flat major harmony initially led us to believe that this piece might be in major mode, the C minor harmony here quickly disabuses us of that notion. In some early editions, a D is given instead of E-flat in measure 7, which makes the chord a plain cadential 6/4. This is incorrect. Chopin's manuscript clearly shows that the pitch should be E-flat. But in order to understand the musical logic behind the E-flat, we should first take a look at measures 34 to 35, where the same material recurs in a different guise. Here you can see that E-flat is a suspension that resolves downwards to D. If we were to get rid of the suspension and have D right away, the result would not only be less expressive, but it would actually be forbidden due to parallel octaves. So here the E-flat helps to keep Chopin marginally out of trouble. E-flat is also a good choice back in measure 7 because it makes the inner line reflect the broad C E-flat D motion in the bass line more locally. The start of the first theme is remarkable because it is at once a beginning and an ending. With the change in tempo and time signature in measure 8, along with the establishment of more regular waltz-like rhythm, we can definitely sense that something new is unfolding. At the same time, however, the theme actually begins with a cadence. That is, harmonically speaking, the theme continues on from where the introduction leaves off and brings it to a conclusion. In fact, the theme seems to be cadentially obsessed. It is like a musical example of the rhetorical device known as epistrophe, where the same words are repeated at the end of successive phrases. The technique can be quite effective at conveying a sense of fatalistic inevitability. The theme reminds me of how unhappy people tend to be stuck in a mental loop, fruitlessly thinking about the same thing over and over again. And if what you keep thinking about over and over again is a perfect authentic cadence in G minor, you must be terribly unhappy. No matter how hard you try, you cannot escape the gravity of G minor. The sighing figures seem to question the inevitability of this tragic pole, but to no avail. The D to C motion should resolve downwards to B flat, while the E to F sharp motion should resolve upwards to G. But the decisive resolution to these sighing figures would not arrive until the start of the coda, where B flat and G are prominently stated at registral extremes. Attempts to seek refuge in the relative major prove futile. Note how the phrasing in measures 14 to 15 connects the two elements of the theme, the arpeggiated figure and the sighing figure, for the first time. This phrasing undermines the resolution to B-flat major in measure 15, emphasizing that we're just passing through the relative major, and the perfect authentic cadence in G minor remains our ultimate goal. Chopin allows us to luxuriate in A major harmony in measure 32, as this harmony foreshadows the key area that we'll be visiting in the development section. The florid outburst that follows is by far the most elaborate attempt to break free from G minor. But again, the relative major only brings temporary relief. As mentioned, the material here parallels what happened near the start of the piece. It's as if no real progress has been made at all. The transition raises tension through the rhythmic intensification of the sighing figure. Recall that in the first theme, the sighing figure was presented in dotted half notes. Now it's given in quarter notes. By measure 48, the sighing figure is incorporated into a whirlwind of eighth notes. The outcome of this process of intensification is the explosion of wide-ranging arpeggiation of G minor harmony in measure 56, heard against a horn call figure in the left hand. Through a downward chromatic slide, we reach F in the bass, which seems to imply the dominance of B-flat major. So we would expect the second theme to be given in the conventional relative major. But after the horn calls on F and C, it turns out that the second theme actually begins on the dominance of E-flat major and settles into this key, which is the submediant rather than the expected relative major. We can see a connection here with the first theme, which similarly started out with the move from the dominant to the tonic, with scale degree 3 progressing to scale degree 1 in the treble. A more flowing material is presented in measure 82. The right-hand figure here seems to be deliberately crafted to evolve into the arpeggiated figure from the first theme. This is quite clever because the material does lead smoothly into the reappearance of the first theme in A minor in measure 94, initiating the development section. This time we can feel greater tension because, in contrast to the frequent authentic cadences in the initial appearance of the theme, there is a persistent dominant pedal here, as if to keep us in a state of nervous anticipation on the precipice of imminent doom. But then, against all odds, a gloriously transformed second theme bursts out in A major, full of hope and promise. This is to be the high point, the most radiantly positive moment in the piece. The formerly rhapsodic turn figure from measure 4 now returns as part of an impassioned outpouring. The passage culminates in an expressive half-diminished seventh harmony in measure 124, which miraculously collapses into the dominant seventh of E-flat major. The dominant seventh of E-flat major is embellished by a colorfully disorienting octatonic collection in measure 130, as if to cleanse our palate and prepare us for the striking character contrast that is to come. The scherzando material that begins in measure 138 could be considered a new theme. However, you could also see it as a kind of hybrid theme. It's in E-flat major, the key of the second theme. At the same time, the waltz-like character and prominent sighing figures seem to be derived from the first theme. The sequential treatment that follows is essentially Much Ado About Nothing. Even when the sequence is chromatically altered and rhythmically intensified to reach a dramatic F-sharp minor harmony in measure 154, what follows brings us back to E-flat major once again. The long descending scale that leads into the return of the second theme in E-flat major is structured in such a way that you can detect an implied ascent to B-flat that is embedded in the prevailing descent. Though lacking the grandeur of its A major transformation, the second theme still unfolds with a flowing elegance, eloquent and calmly optimistic. For the moment, we feel that everything might just turn out to be all right after all. However, this sense of optimism vanishes with the return of the first theme in G minor, which puts us back into a state of nervous anticipation once more. Like at the start of the development section, there is a persistent dominant pedal here. In fact, you could even say that the entire theme has become one massive dominance harmony, building up immense tension that will be resolved in the coda. I've always found measure 206 to be an especially poignant moment. The left-hand pattern here reminds us of measure 106, the brilliant A major transformation of the second theme, even though the music is now firmly rooted in the tragic realm of G minor. It's as if you are recalling a happier time while being fully aware that things will never be the same again. The coda is a fiery, syncopated dance in duple time, perhaps reminiscent of the Polish folk dance known as the Krakowiak. In measures 216 to 217, the broad harmonic implications from the start of the piece become tightly compressed into cadential outbursts. As we head towards the conclusion of the piece, one very striking feature is that the pitch E natural keeps recurring like an insistent cry. You recall that E natural was the prominent bass tone in the development section, and it's perhaps most memorably associated with the positive A major transformation of the second theme. As such, you could say that the recurrences of E natural here represent desperate attempts to recall happier memories as everything around you grows ever darker and more hopeless. The last appearance of E natural comes as a piercing scream that initiates a dramatic fall to the tragic end. Thanks for watching.